that requires something a little bit more fluid, a little bit more flexible. If you look at the function of government in most countries, it's pretty much established to work in a normalcy with slight variations from time to time. But then suddenly you get something of this magnitude. First of all, there appears to be very few common triggers that could alert people and get them moving quickly into a new phase of the extraordinary. And then secondly, even if they did have the triggers, it seems that there's a lot of tardiness, despite what people say. And I'm not a critic, I'm just making an observation. There's tardiness in actually recognizing the severity and the seriousness of the situation and the sorts of flexibility and fluidity that's necessary. I coined an expression earlier on today about silo fluidity, and the government structures are being used, or the structures of government are being used in the same way that they would be used in normal circumstances, but they're being applied to an extraordinary situation.
So we both had the privilege of being on an international conference on new thinking earlier today, coming out of Europe, as a matter of fact. And were there any solutions or ideas to take this triggers or silo fluidity or what you're talking about forward? Any ideas you picked up on in particular?
I think there's a general consensus that there needs to be a framework, an international framework that may not necessarily have all of the historical impediments that, for instance, the United Nations had, but nevertheless something that can trigger an international common response, particularly things like sharing of data, which would allow for prediction of where things are going to happen. And let's face it, we had the early warning of a potential problem with the Ebola situation a few years ago, and the SARS and bird flu. So the signals were there, but it would appear that it was business as usual, so that when something like this, and let's face it, this is, whilst it's a very serious virus and made that much more difficult because of the absence of a vaccine, it's not a killer, for instance, that the plague would be. So just imagine if we had been facing something like that, where not only would we not be able to get out and about, but the chances of catching these sorts of things would be much, much more high, and the virulence of the disease would be that much higher. Imagine what that would have been. And if we had had a business as usual approach to that, that would have been catastrophic. So my point in that conference was to say, let's try and step away from traditional structures, silos, individual regulation, and recognize there are certain things of a global nature that require a global or an international response, and then start putting an infrastructure together to make that happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds great. And, obviously we live in a very complex world with all kinds, as we've alluded to before, different types of governments, more agreement versus being forced to comply in different governments and countries. But I know you in your studies have talked in the past about Rousseau and the social contract. Where does that fit in with all of this, and what we need to remember nowadays in our modern world?
I think it's front and center. It's that trade-off between what amount of your individual freedom are you going to trade in, to use a modern parlance, in exchange for the protection given by your state or your government. Only now, and there's two elements to this. One is the importance of ground truth information, the reality checks to make sure the information that's being provided is correct. And secondly, and the use of that information wisely addresses the other concern, which is that of fear, because fear tends to to generate all sorts of bizarre behaviors in people. So if we are able to do those two things in concert in an international framework, then I think that there would be a lot of satisfaction, or more satisfaction, with the efforts of those who are responsible. And we wouldn't find the political point scoring that we find in some countries, or protests that we find in other countries, but rather a more likely compliance or a likely alignment because of values with the steps that are being taken by those in authority.
Wow, it's fascinating how you can take you from your policing perspective and bring it out into, history spanning centuries and literature spanning centuries. Before we wrap up, Douglas, how do you wish people to get in touch with you if they want to carry the conversation further, or, bring you in for some consulting, perhaps?
Well, I'm going to revert to another email address because I'm having difficulty with the one that I set up specifically for this. So the email address is dbrand and the number 2 at hotmail.com.
Okay. All right, good. And just a final question then, because we're focusing on policing. We've heard that on one hand, there are decreases in crime because people are actually being more conscientious, staying home. Even the thugs perhaps were staying home. On the other hand, there's an increase in domestic violence, child abuse, and there's a threat if the economic crisis drags out a little bit further that crime could go up, things like burglaries, break-ins, petty theft, and so on. We have a couple of minutes here to discuss that. So what's your take on that, both in England, but also just looking at human nature in general?
Yeah, I think you're right that some certain types of crimes have gone down and others have gone up. Sadly, we could have predicted that if you put people together in an artificially hot-housed situation and the relationship isn't particularly good in any case, then we're going to get deteriorations which lead to domestic violence, and that's dreadful. And we've seen in the UK something like a 25% increase in the number of calls to various lines, telephone lines for help and that sort of thing. But there is a really interesting, in your questions, a really interesting balance that needs to be achieved, because all the time at the moment we are focusing quite rightly on the health side of things, and the health side of things and all of the infrastructure that supports that, in our case, the National Health Service, to protect it, to make sure it's not overwhelmed. But there is an argument to say that we need to have other things running in parallel. And I need to do some more thinking on this, but it does seem to me that living with the virus rather than having it as a sort of a combatant in like a conflict might be a way of managing, so that we recognize that it's going to be around for a while. Eventually we'll develop some ways of vaccinating ourselves or better processes for protection. But in the meantime, we still have economies to maintain, we still have jobs to maintain. And the downside of not maintaining the economy is what you were talking about in relation to people resorting to crime purely to get, funds for purchasing basics and things of that nature. I put that rather crudely, but my concern is that an imbalance in the emphasis between health and the economy and the whole sort of social infrastructure of our countries can lead to potential problems down the road. So it may be our new thinking might be, how do we live with some of the risk and at the same time manage to continue with our economy and develop our social infrastructures, etc.
Interesting. Okay, cool. And do you find that policing legislation or behaviors on the part of police who are looking to, and I love distinction between British policing, which is keeping the peace, and American policing, which is law enforcement. So at least from the British side, keeping the peace, do you see new ways that there'll be different relationships between the police and the public, at least in England, if not on a wider scale, given what we're going through now?
I hope so. In every part of society, we're going to find differences coming out the other end of this. But I do hope that in some of the positives that come out of this, we'll have a much better relationship with policing and that sort of thing, in the same way as we're finding that we're valuing delivery drivers and binmen and people like that, as well as our medical staff, because of the service they bring and the essentials that they provide in order to help us continue living. So I think that we'll see some very positive things coming out the other side of this.
Fantastic. Super. Really appreciate your insights as usual, Douglas. And once again, to get a hold of Douglas Brand, you can email him at dbrand, then number 2, dbrand2@hotmail.com. All right. Thank you, Mr. Brand. And thank you for our listeners as well for coming to the show this week. We invite you to check in on sobradionetwork.com. Check out the archives with lots of different shows and different living legacy leaders like Douglas. And also check out gamechangerthinking.com, my website. Thank you so much to our producer, Joe. And let me just remind you that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Thank you. Stay healthy. Bye-bye now.